The night he told the dinner table I hadn't been quite myself lately, in front of my own parents, was the night I understood he had started building a story about me that I would eventually have to answer for. My name is Marisol. His name was Julian. And by the time this story ends, you will understand why I spent 13 months keeping a second phone inside a hollowed-out paperback on a shelf he considered too boring to ever touch. I want to begin by saying that Julian was not cruel in any way strangers would recognize. He was charming, articulate, the kind of man who remembered the names of waitstaff and asked thoughtful questions at dinner parties. It took me years to understand that this charm was not incidental to his control over me. It was the mechanism of it. A man who is universally well-liked can say almost anything about his wife, and people will believe him before they believe her, simply because believing him requires no uncomfortable reconsideration of anyone's judgment. We had been married 4 years when the comment at dinner happened. Together 6. In the early years, Julian's attentiveness looked, from any reasonable distance, like devotion. He asked about my day in detail. He remembered small things I mentioned in passing. It took time for me to notice that this same attentiveness also meant he tracked, with total precision, every inconsistency in what I said, every mood that didn't match his expectations, filing it all away for moments exactly like that dinner, when a single, gently concerned comment in front of my parents could plant a seed of doubt about my own reliability that would grow for months afterward. I hadn't been quite myself lately. He said it softly, almost affectionately, reaching over to squeeze my hand as though offering comfort rather than delivering a quiet, public verdict. My mother's face changed immediately, concern flooding in exactly as Julian had intended. My father asked, carefully, if everything was all right. I said I was fine. I said it too quickly, the way people do when a question catches them off guard, and I watched Julian's expression settle into something satisfied, having successfully demonstrated, to the two people whose opinion of me mattered most, that I could not entirely be trusted to accurately report my own state of mind. I did not confront him that night. I want to be honest about that because I think honesty matters more in this story than anger does. I smiled through the rest of dinner. I helped clear the plates. And later, lying awake beside a man who had just quietly begun constructing a version of me designed to make my own future claims about him less credible, I made a decision that would occupy the next 13 months of my life. I decided that whatever Julian was building, I would build something else entirely, in complete privacy, until the day I had enough of my own truth documented that his version would simply collapse under the weight of mine. The bookshelf became my headquarters, specifically a hollowed-out copy of a dense economics textbook Julian had bought years earlier with the intention of reading and had never once opened, sitting on a high shelf gathering dust in a way that made it the perfect hiding place. Inside, I kept a prepaid phone purchased with cash from a shop across town, charged only in short bursts, and a small notebook where I began recording, in precise, dated entries, every instance of Julian quietly reframing my own experiences back to me in front of other people. The pattern, once I started documenting it deliberately rather than simply absorbing it, was more extensive than I had allowed myself to fully see. Comments to coworkers about my sensitive reactions to ordinary disagreements. A running narrative, delivered gently and consistently to his own family, about how I sometimes forgot things or got confused about timelines, always framed with such visible affection and patience that anyone hearing it would conclude Julian was a remarkably tolerant husband rather than a man carefully constructing a case against his wife's credibility, one small comment at a time. Julian worked as a senior claims attorney at a firm called Bramall Torres, representing corporate clients in disputes over commercial contracts. He had made partner 3 years earlier, a fact he mentioned often, and had built a reputation, among the people who mattered to his career, as meticulous and persuasive, a lawyer who won cases by controlling the narrative long before he ever entered a courtroom. His mentor at the firm, and the person whose approval he valued above almost anyone else's, was a senior partner named Agustin Reyes, 63 years old, a man who had built Bramall Torres's reputation over 3 decades on a foundation of scrupulous, old-fashioned professional integrity. I had met Augustine several times at firm functions, a formal, courteous man who once told me, with obvious pride, that Julian was the most careful lawyer I've mentored in years, someone I trust completely with clients who can't afford a single misstep. I remember smiling and believing him because at the time I had no reason to doubt it. That changed 10 months into my quiet documentation. On an evening, Julian left his laptop open on the kitchen counter longer than usual, absorbed in a call in the next room. A folder caught my attention only because of its careful, almost too neutral name: Client Correspondence Archive. Attorneys, I understood even with my limited knowledge, generally maintained privileged client files through the firm's own secure systems, not personal folders on a home laptop. Inside were drafts of settlement agreements for a case Julian had recently closed on behalf of a corporate client, alongside a separate set of documents showing that Julian had, in the course of negotiating that settlement, quietly withheld evidence from opposing counsel that would have significantly increased the payout owed to a group of injured former employees, evidence he was legally and ethically obligated to disclose. Attached emails between Julian and the client's general counsel, a man named Preston Whitlock, made clear this was not an isolated oversight but a deliberate, repeated strategy across several cases, one that had saved Whitlock's company millions of dollars while leaving injured claimants with settlements far smaller than they were owed. I did not touch the laptop further. I closed the folder exactly as I had found it and returned to my seat before Julian finished his call, and I sat there afterward for a long time, understanding, with a slow, sick clarity, that the man who had spent years quietly undermining my own credibility to the people who loved me had also spent years deliberately withholding evidence from people who had been genuinely, seriously harmed and deserved to be made whole. Over the following 11 weeks, I documented what I could, using the prepaid phone during narrow windows when Julian left himself logged in, always careful, always brief. I sent nothing forward yet. I understood, even then, that what I had found involved real people who had been hurt and shortchanged, and that acting too quickly, without full understanding, could destroy evidence before it could ever help them. During this period, Julian's quiet campaign around my credibility did not slow. If anything, it intensified, an instinct I have since learned is common in men like him, some subconscious sense of shifting ground even before any specific discovery surfaces. He began, more frequently, gently suggesting to friends that I seemed stressed or overwhelmed, always in a tone of loving concern that made any objection from me look, to anyone listening, like further proof of the very instability he was describing. I made certain, during this time, that my own behavior remained calm and unremarkable in every visible way, because I understood that any reaction from me would simply become more material for the story he was building. The night I understood the full scope of what Julian had done, I was not looking at his laptop at all. I was sorting old boxes in our storage closet at his request, files from his years as a junior associate, before he made partner, back when he had worked under a different senior attorney who had since left the firm under circumstances Julian had always described vaguely as a difference in philosophy. Inside one box, beneath old case notes, was a folder of early correspondence with Preston Whitlock, dated years before Julian's current position, establishing that this exact pattern, quietly withholding evidence to protect corporate clients at the expense of injured claimants, had been Julian's practice since the very beginning of his career, refined and perfected over a decade. I called my closest friend, a woman named Odette, who worked as a paralegal at an unrelated firm, that night from the hollowed-out book's phone, standing in the closet with the door pulled shut, Julian asleep in the next room. When I explained what I had found, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the words that finally pushed me from careful documentation into deliberate motion. She said, "Marisol, this isn't just about your marriage anymore. These are people who got hurt and got cheated out of what they were owed. You need someone who understands exactly what this is." Odette connected me, through her own firm's network, to a legal ethics investigator named Cassandra Boykin, who specialized in exactly this kind of attorney misconduct. I called Cassandra from a payphone outside a diner, paying with coins saved specifically for this purpose. She listened to my description of the withheld evidence and the pattern with Preston Whitlock for nearly 40 minutes without interrupting, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful weight of someone who understood immediately how serious it was. She told me two things I have carried with me since. The first was that what I was describing sounded like a sustained pattern of discovery violations and professional misconduct, the kind of case that draws attention not only from a firm's internal ethics committee, but potentially from the State Bar Association, given the scale and the vulnerability of the claimants involved. The second thing she said more quietly. She said, "Marisol, once this moves forward, it will not stop at your marriage. It could end his license to practice law entirely. I need you to understand that before we take another step." I told her I had understood that for months, and that understanding what those injured claimants had lost was exactly why I could not simply walk away without acting. Over the following 10 weeks, working carefully through the prepaid phone and narrow windows of opportunity, I sent Cassandra everything: the photographed settlement documents, the correspondence with Preston Whitlock, the older files establishing the pattern's origin at the start of Julian's career. Cassandra compiled a preliminary investigative summary, methodical and precise, designed to withstand scrutiny from a firm that had every incentive to hope it was not true. While Cassandra worked, I made two further preparations. The first was a consultation with a family attorney named Genevieve Oakry, recommended through Odette's network, who specialized in cases involving reputational and psychological control within marriages, a pattern she described with an accuracy that unsettled me the first time I heard my own experience, summarized so precisely by a stranger. Genevieve began quietly preparing documentation of the pattern of credibility-undermining behavior I had lived under for years, in case Julian attempted, as she warned me he likely would, to use that same manufactured narrative against me once the larger truth came out. The second preparation was smaller, more personal. I began, item by careful item, moving what remained of my own independent belongings, my late grandmother's china, a collection of my own academic degrees and awards Julian had always found excessive to display, into a storage unit rented under a slight variation of my maiden name, funded by savings I had quietly redirected from freelance writing work Julian assumed I had abandoned years earlier. I was not fleeing. I understood, by then, the distinction clearly. I was simply arriving, slowly, at a life that no longer required his narration to be believed. The final piece arrived on an ordinary Friday, when Julian mentioned over dinner, with quiet pride, that Bramall Torres had just assigned him 3 new corporate defense cases, all involving similar liability disputes, all with Preston Whitlock's company as the client once again. He said it the way men like him say things they assume no one else at the table is equipped to fully understand the implications of. I refilled his water glass and said nothing, because I understood immediately what those new cases actually meant. More injured claimants, more withheld evidence, more people quietly cheated out of what they were rightfully owed, while everyone around him continued to trust his careful, persuasive reputation completely. That same week, Cassandra finished her preliminary report. Genevieve filed the protective documentation the following morning, submitting Cassandra's findings simultaneously to the State Bar's Ethics Division and to Bramall Torres's own internal ethics council, ensuring the information could not simply be quietly absorbed by anyone at the firm still loyal to Julian. I made one final call myself, to Augustine Reyes's office directly, using my full name for the first time in months, requesting an urgent private meeting regarding what I described only as a serious matter involving professional conduct. His assistant, a woman named Lorna, asked for more detail. I said it was personal and it could not wait, and something in my voice must have carried real weight because she found me an opening the very next morning. I dressed with unusual care, a tailored navy suit purchased with my own freelance income, hair pulled back, wearing my grandmother's small pearl earrings, one of the few items I had kept back from storage. I did not attempt to disguise the particular tiredness in my own face, the exhaustion of a woman who had spent 13 months being quietly vigilant every single day, because I understood, by then, that this too was its own kind of evidence, even if no formal document would ever record it. Bramall Torres's offices occupied an elegant, wood-paneled floor downtown, all leather chairs and framed diplomas, the visual language of a firm that had built its identity around old-fashioned trust. Augustine's office was lined with photographs from decades of legal conferences and a single framed quote about integrity being the only currency a lawyer truly owns. He stood when I entered, shook my hand formally, and gestured to a chair, his expression carrying the polite curiosity of a man with no idea his morning was about to end very differently than it began. I placed a sealed folder on his desk and slid it toward him, without preamble. Inside was the summary Cassandra and Genevieve had prepared together, the withheld evidence documents alongside the correspondence with Preston Whitlock, the older files establishing the pattern's origin at the very start of Julian's career, and a cover letter noting that copies had already been submitted to the State Bar's Ethics Division that same morning. Augustine opened the folder slowly. He read the first page, then the second, and I watched his expression move through the sequence I had, by then, come to recognize in anyone confronted, all at once, with the discovery that someone they trusted completely had been quietly betraying the very profession they had built their reputation defending. Confusion first, then a dawning, sickened comprehension, as he began to understand how many injured claimants, across how many years, had been quietly shortchanged by a man he had personally mentored and vouched for. He looked up at me once, about halfway through, his hand pressed flat against the desk. I did not look away. I simply let him keep reading. When he finished, he closed the folder carefully, both hands flat against it, the stillness of a man absorbing a betrayal that struck at the very foundation of everything he had spent 30 years building. He asked, quietly, how long I had known. I told him the truth, that I had understood the full scope only in recent months, though the pattern itself, I suspected, predated even his mentorship of Julian. He thanked me, his voice unsteady in a way I had not expected from a man so composed at every firm function I had attended, and told me the firm would cooperate fully with any investigation, whatever the cost to its own reputation. I stood, thanked him for his time, and told him the ethics filing had already gone out that morning, timed deliberately so no one at the firm would have the opportunity to quietly manage the problem before the bar's own investigators could examine it independently. Augustine nodded once, slowly, already reaching for his phone as I left the room. Outside the building, I stood on the sidewalk for several minutes before walking to my car, not to collect myself, because that work had been done slowly over 13 months and there was nothing left to gather in that moment, but because I wanted to remember precisely how it felt. The folder leaving my hands, the particular quality of silence in a room where a man who had spent decades defending the integrity of his profession understood, all at once, how deeply it had been betrayed from. Within his own circle, Julian called at 2 o'clock. I let it go to voicemail. He called twice more within the hour, each time closer together, the rhythm of a man beginning to sense, without yet understanding the specifics, that something fundamental had shifted beneath him without his permission. At 3:30, he sent a single text. It said only, "What is going on?" Not quite the same words as other men in other stories, but carrying the same undertone of a man who already suspected the answer and dreaded confirming it. I did not respond. I drove instead to the storage unit, sat for a while beside the boxes holding what remained of my life before Julian, my grandmother's china carefully wrapped, my own diplomas finally displayed rather than hidden away, and allowed myself, for the first time in 13 months, to simply breathe without calculating a single next move. Then I drove home, because Genevieve had advised maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy until the filings were formally processed, and because I wanted one final ordinary evening in that house as a woman who understood exactly what was coming, while Julian still did not. He came home late that night, unusually subdued, and did not mention the folder or the calls or the text. He asked, instead, whether I wanted to order dinner, his voice carrying the careful, softened tone he used whenever some instinct told him his control over a narrative was slipping and needed to be gently recaptured rather than forced. I told him I had already eaten. I went to bed early. He sat alone downstairs for a long time before he finally came up. The bar's ethics division opened a formal investigation within 2 weeks, and Bramall Torres placed Julian on unpaid leave shortly after, once their own internal review confirmed the pattern Cassandra had already independently documented. He was disbarred 9 months later, once the scale of the misconduct, ultimately traced across at least 11 separate cases and involving settlements shortchanged by a combined total in the millions, became impossible for the bar to characterize as an isolated lapse in judgment. I did not attend the disciplinary hearings that eventually followed, though Odette did several times and reported back to me afterward in a voice that had shifted over the months from professional outrage to something quieter and more settled. Julian avoided criminal charges, as such matters often resolve through professional discipline rather than prosecution, but the restitution proceedings that followed, filed on behalf of the original injured claimants by a class action firm that took up the case once the bar's findings became public, would follow him financially for years. By then, I had stopped measuring justice by any single outcome and started measuring it, instead, by the simple fact that people who had been quietly cheated for over a decade would finally receive some portion of what they had always been owed. Julian's mother, a woman named Corinne who had never once, in 6 years, asked me a single question about my own life beyond how well I was managing her son's stress, called me once, weeks after he moved out. She asked whether I had known before it became public what he had actually been doing. I told her the truth, that I had known enough, eventually, to understand it needed to stop, and that I regretted it had taken this particular shape to get there. She was quiet for a long moment, and then, in a voice stripped of the polite distance she had always maintained with me, she said she was sorry, for years spent quietly believing her son's version of our marriage over any version I might have offered myself. We have not spoken since, but I think of that call sometimes, the strange, late arrival of an apology that changes nothing and still, somehow, matters. I moved eventually into a small apartment near Odette's own building, close enough that we began having dinner together most weeks for the first time in years, far enough from the house Julian and I had shared that I stopped, within a few months, rehearsing explanations for feelings I had never actually needed to justify in the first place. Odette helped me unpack the last of my boxes on a quiet Saturday in late autumn, and when we finished, we sat on the floor of my new living room, the hollowed-out economics textbook open between us, empty now, kept only as a strange, private souvenir of 13 months I do not regret and would never wish to repeat. I think often about the woman I was the night Julian gently told our dinner table I hadn't been quite myself lately, and about how long it took me to understand that the softness of his concern had never once meant care. I did not destroy Julian. I want to be precise about that, the way precision has come to matter to me since. Julian destroyed the trust of people who had already been seriously harmed and believed, reasonably, that the legal process existed to make them whole rather than to quietly protect the company that hurt them. I simply stopped allowing him to narrate my own reality back to me, and once I stopped, the rest of what he had built, brick by careful brick, no longer had anywhere left to hide. The most dangerous thing a man like Julian can do is assume that a woman who has stopped defending herself out loud has also stopped keeping score. I had 13 months of score running beneath my silence, and by the time he understood that, the story had already been finished, filed, and delivered, in an office lined with quotes about integrity, by a woman he had once quietly decided the whole table should feel a little sorry for.